U.S. consumer demand has been elevated since the summer of 2020. We have so much cargo coming across the Pacific Ocean, unlike anything we've ever seen before.
Estimates of 30 to 40% increases in freight demand between now and the next few decades are prevalent.
It's really a question of saving shipping costs, saving time versus that lack of predictability.
Throughout the last 2 years, you've had economies opening and closing and ports doing the same and factories and all the rest. And all of those little mismatches, along with some kind of fundamental ones between different countries, have thrown our supply chains out of balance.
It's just like bam, bam, bam.
The United States lags behind the rest of the world when it comes to passenger trains, but when it comes to the freight railroad, the U.S. is dominating. The freight rail network in the U.S. operates over 140,000 miles of privately owned track in every state except for Hawaii. It moves 1/3 of all U.S. exports and roughly 40% of long-distance freight volume.
The North American freight rail network is considered the most efficient, the largest, and the most profitable freight rail network in the world.
It competes directly with the trucking industry to move goods around the country, shipping everything from coal to cars to chemicals. And with the rise of e-commerce companies like Amazon, trains are increasingly moving consumer goods as well.
If you see it on a shelf, we likely had a hand in moving it.
There are 7 major freight railroads that connect North America. Union Pacific and BNSF dominate the West. CSX and Norfolk Southern are the primary East Coast operators, while Kansas City Southern, along with Canadian Pacific and Canadian National, run routes north and south. Amtrak, which is the United States passenger service, owns only 3% of the country's rail. In 2019, the top 5 railroads in the U.S. had a total operating revenue of over $71 billion. BNSF, a subsidiary of Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, is not publicly traded, but the remaining 4 U.S. companies have seen their stock on a steady climb over the last several years.
The railroads are incredibly profitable and actually are achieving profits that they've never seen in their entire history. That unfortunately is not true for passenger railroad. Amtrak continues to lose money. It's the only major for-profit railroad in the United States that hauls passengers, and yet it has never made a profit.
The future of freight demand in this country is strong. Estimates of 30 to 40% increases in freight demand between now and the next few decades are prevalent.
But the freight rail industry's success has not come without its challenges. The industry has dealt with bankruptcies, the lack of demand for coal, and the more recent supply chain bottlenecks and rise in thefts. The 7 top railroads, which own the majority of the tracks in North America, have also been criticized for monopolistic power over the rail industry.
They tend to be very oligopolic and have an enormous amount of power in pricing, and there isn't a lot of competition.
CNBC explores how freight railroads became so profitable and how the industry plans to evolve to stay on top. The U.S. railroad dates back to the year 1830, before airplanes or automobiles were even invented. Passenger rail and freight were in high demand to move people and things around the expanding country.
It's been an economic backbone of the United States, and in many ways plays a core and central theme in American history, and particularly the state of the economy.
The railroad has seen many high and low points. By 1917, 1,500 railroads operated on 254,000 miles of track. The 40s and 50s brought the rise of cars, air travel, and trucking. Up until that point, there was basically no competition for passenger or freight rail besides other railroad companies, and the industry was subject to federal regulation that set rates and profit levels.
After World War II, the federal government built this incredible interstate highway network and really lit trucking on fire, but didn't relax the regulatory standards on the rail industry, even though the competition increased dramatically.
It wasn't until 1980, when the Staggers Act was enacted, that these regulations were loosened. It allowed railroads to choose routes, prices, and services, and brought profits back to the railroads. Since then, many redundant routes and railroad mergers have consolidated the industry.
There was a series of about 5 or 6 different mergers that allowed the Union Pacific to be the 32,000 miles of mainline track that we see here today.
Without M&A, chances are that rail as a percent of overall freight would be a much less important part of our domestic freight network.
Kansas City Southern just recently agreed to merge with Canadian Pacific, and if the Surface Transportation Board approves, it will create the only railroad linking Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Today, the U.S. has some of the most profitable freight railroad businesses in the world, achieving billions in profits. Passenger rail, however, has not seen a similar comeback.
While freight railroads have invested at least $25 billion a year over year into their networks over the past several decades, passenger rail has not had the same level of benefit. When it comes to Amtrak, the federal government has traditionally been the primary funder of Amtrak, and the amount of funding pales in comparison to funding levels that have occurred in other countries.
Experts say geography and privatization of the rail freight industry is why some consider it to be the most efficient in the world.
The rest of the world does things quite a bit differently. In most of the rest of the world, the rail network is nationalized. It isn't owned by a particular company.
The United States geography is the primary reason that freight railroad and the freight network in the United States is far superior to what you see in other countries. A lot of what railroads depend upon are bulk commodities, agricultural commodities, and mining that we get out of the ground. And a lot of those materials come from the center part of the country. And because these are going to non-populated areas, rail is really well positioned and is a far superior mode of traffic than you see with trucks.
These companies compete with each other, but also must work together and coordinate shipments since there is not one central owner of the railroad.
In order for us to provide service for a customer, say from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, we have to hand off those products, those boxes, those carloads to a different carrier on the east side of the network.
Freight railroads are what I like to call the middle miles. And so when you're looking at international traffic, for example, on the West Coast, you have ships bringing in goods, and those are transloaded either directly into train or into truck. Train takes the long miles, the middle miles of those trips, and then hands those off to truck often at the end of the trip. So we all work together as one overall network.
Through the reduction of companies and consolidation, railroad market power has increased.
They are occasionally brought up in front of the regulators for not servicing, but also not charging fair market rates. They're constantly under the lens and constantly accused of exercising more monopolistic practices in their pricing. Not so much on the intermodal traffic, which has to sort of stay naturally competitive with truck traffic, but more so on the bulk goods that there isn't really an equivalent truck competition.
The Biden administration issued an executive order last July that calls for regulation on the freight industry, targeting a practice known as reciprocal switching. Reciprocal switching is intended to foster more competitive environments for shippers. Because the freight companies own certain stretches of track, the regulation would force them to open up the tracks to other freight companies, giving shippers more options of who to work with and therefore creating a more competitive market. The practice is already common in Canada, and some freight railroads have switching agreements which came as a result of previous mergers. When Amtrak was created, part of the deal was its passenger trains would still have access to tracks owned by the freight companies. Amtrak pays host railroads $142 million a year to use their tracks.
It comes at a time when we're trying to move as much freight as we can throughout the supply chain, and to do anything that would knowingly undermine the fluidity of the freight network is frankly wrong-headed and at odds with the overarching goal of maximizing freight movement. The system works. The Surface Transportation Board is in place to adjudicate rate disputes and determine whether or not a particular rate might be reasonable or not.
The Surface Transportation Board, the agency who oversees economic regulation in the industry, is holding a public hearing to discuss the matter in March. The railroad companies rely on the trucking industry, but also compete with them for customers.
Truck is the biggest form of competition for railroads in North America. Trucks have an advantage on the smaller shipments that are associated more commonly with consumer products. Rails have a big advantage on what I would call bulk commodities that are heavy and move in larger quantities.
Historically, a big portion of rail volumes came from moving coal throughout the country. In 2019, coal shipments were down 45% from their peak in 2006. Today, the rise of e-commerce and companies like Amazon have made intermodal containers its biggest shipment. Intermodal containers can move seamlessly from a ship to a train to a truck without having to be unpacked.
We've become a more intermodal intensive industry. And so things that we hadn't done in the past as much as move smaller packages. We're doing a lot more of that. It gives you more breadth and more reach in terms of the customers that you can serve.
That freight rail is the most environmentally friendly way to move goods over land. We emit about 25% of carbon emissions that our trucking partners do. One intermodal freight train carries upwards of 200 containers, and so that's 200 trucks worth of goods on one train.
And for the railroads themselves, it's far more profitable. They can charge a much higher rate on a per mile basis by hauling intermodal traffic than just hauling general commodities.
Los Angeles and Chicago are the two top areas in the U.S. for intermodal trains. Theft of these boxes have been on the rise recently. In LA, Union Pacific containers carrying packages for companies like UPS, FedEx, and Amazon were found open, and a trail of empty boxes lined the tracks.
A handful of years ago, theft out of an intermodal box was a nuisance. Happened every once in a while, wasn't organized. Today, over the course of about the last year and a half, that theft has become very well organized. We have a concentrated issue in the LA basin.
Los Angeles ports are a crucial part of the global supply chain. The Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach together take in 40% of all goods sent to the U.S. by water. Millions of containers and billions of dollars worth of goods move through the port every year. Supply chain issues during the pandemic have led to a backup at the ports, with lots of containers waiting to move into the country.
When the supply chain is facing challenges, freight railroads are facing challenges. And we've been working hard to do our part to help alleviate supply chain challenges facing this country. And that's through operating 24/7. It's through working with our maritime and our trucking partners to keep goods moving, to stand up additional capacity, and really try to keep the economy going.
As the industry looks to the future, automation and the rise of self-driving truck companies like Embark and Plus could take more of the freight industry's market share.
If you think about it on a per mile basis, there are estimates that an autonomous truck would actually reduce the cost of running a truck by as much as 70%. If that plays out, that's going to put significant pressure on the railroads because they simply cannot maintain high pricing and really participate in that intermodal traffic.
We see an awful lot of emphasis on autonomous trucks, and I'm pretty sure within our lifetime we'll see driverless trucks on the road. But we also then need to be able to automate the railroads to keep up with that.
Union Pacific has invested in Too Simple, a self-driving truck startup, as a way to keep up with developments. It also said at the company's Investor Day in 2021 that ultimately our answer to autonomous trucks is autonomous trains. There are companies like Parallel Systems currently working on prototypes of self-driving trains.
Of course, we're looking to be as competitive as we can in the future. There's a lot of pieces that go into that, but certainly the technology and kind of the backbone of that technology, we think exists, and we're pursuing those opportunities.
Despite being the dominant mover of freight in the U.S., the trucking industry is facing a labor shortage, an issue that only grew worse during the pandemic.
Labor as a percent of overall railroads is far less than what you see with the trucking industry. So autonomous is going to benefit the trucking industry far greater than it would benefit the railroad industry. And so it's a major threat to the railroads. I would fully expect that the railroads will fight through their lobbying efforts to keep autonomous trucks really boxed in and tightly regulated, and will be a big constituent that pushes back on full autonomous.
Trucking makes up 27% of jobs in the transportation industry, compared to rail transportation, which makes up 3%. The rail industry declined by 40,000 jobs from November 2018 to December 2020.
Railroads also have their own set of issues as it relates to labor. The unions that are fighting them on things like precision railroading, which makes the railroads far more efficient and makes the railroads far more dependable, but also means that there's less labor and humans involved in the transportation networks.
Precision scheduled railroading is an operational innovation that helped turn the industry around. It adds and mixes freight cars onto longer trains for fewer trips and reduces the number of stops and crew.
Unions have not particularly liked it, but shareholders of the railroads have loved it, and it's really driven the capital appreciation, the profit appreciation, and the efficiency of the railroads for the past couple decades.
There's pressure to protect jobs. The regulators have to be very, very careful that we don't end up back in the 1970s in 10 or 20 more years when the trucking industry has evolved to being highly innovative and automated, and rails are back holding the two-man crews because the federal government has said you will have a two-man crew rule.
Despite these criticisms and the number of employees in both trucking and freight rail declining, the need to transport goods around the world will not stop. The projected growth for freight volume in the U.S. is expected to grow 50% by 2050.
And it's important that people realize that. We're out there working out on the network outside 24/7. We've done that throughout the pandemic. We've done that throughout the supply chain challenges we've seen, and we'll continue to do that into the future.
The Port of Los Angeles, the busiest port in North America, saw record volume in 2021.
We have so much cargo coming across the Pacific Ocean, unlike anything we've ever seen before. U.S. consumer demand has been elevated since the summer of 2020.
Imports, including furniture, car parts, and apparel, surged to a record of about 5.5 million TEUs in 2021, a 13% increase from the previous high in 2018. But along with that volume came with it an array of headwinds impacting everyone from retail stores and large manufacturers to portside communities. As of February 4th, 2022, there was a backlog of over 90 container ships drifting, slow steaming, or waiting outside the Port of Los Angeles. At the same time, there were almost 69,000 empty containers at the port's terminal and off-dock depots.
Throughout the last 2 years, you've had economies opening and closing, and ports doing the same, and factories and all the rest, workers getting sick, truckers being out of work, and all of those little mismatches, along with some kind of fundamental ones between different countries, have thrown our supply chains out of balance.
From what I've been told from both logistics experts as well as the importers, they tell me at least until the third quarter of 2022, we are going to see these supply chains disruptions because of the immense congestion.
Port congestion also has health implications for the surrounding community.
The ports are a massive economic hub. There's no denying it. There's no denying their global importance. But the impacts on people's health, the impacts on people's quality of life, and the impacts on how long they live can also not be denied.
And it has worldwide implications too. As of November 2021, 11.5% of global vessel capacity was in effect offline as ships waited in queues. So what is causing the bottlenecks at West Coast ports? And what steps are being taken to ease the congestion? The Port of Los Angeles saw record volume in 2021 as U.S. consumers shifted from spending on services like entertainment and travel to household goods and electronics. Container volume at the port in 2021 reached 10.6 million TEUs, almost 16% higher than the previous year and almost 13% more than the previous record set in 2018. A TEU, or 20-foot equivalent unit, is the industry standard to measure cargo capacity for ships and terminals. One 20-foot container can hold about 400 flat-screen TVs. In the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2021, imports surged to a record 5.7 million TEUs, and operating revenue at the port jumped as well, up 22% from the previous year to $572 million. But that crush of goods also brought with it massive bottlenecks as ports struggled to cope from a surge of imports coming from Asia.
These supply chains were designed for a kind of a delicate dance of sorts, with containers moving from one country to the other and then being brought inland and then being shipped back out. And when those mismatches start, well, that whole system breaks down a bit. And that's precisely what we've seen.
One analysis showed the transit time to ship goods from ports in Asia to when it is ready to be picked up in North America has more than doubled since the start of the pandemic.
Soaking up of vessel capacity has tightened the network in the rest of the world, that any small disruption becomes a massive problem. And that's why the rest of the world is, so to speak, suffering from the challenges that are happening in North America.
The movement of containers was also impacted. As of February 4th, 2022, there were more than 44,000 import containers sitting on the docks at the Port of LA, including 66% of containers that have been waiting 4 days or less, 14.6% that have been waiting between 5 to 8 days, and almost 20% that have been waiting 9 days or more. Prior to the pandemic, on average, containers for local delivery sat on the docks for just under 4 days, while those heading to trains remained there for less than 2 days. Surging COVID cases among port workers impacted the flow of goods too. According to media reports, in January 2022, about 800 dock workers, 10% of the workforce at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, were unavailable for work due to a COVID-related reason. To help ease congestion, in the fall of 2021, the Port of Los Angeles committed to 24/7 operations and announced plans to charge ocean carriers a dwell fee for idle containers.
Productivity on the docks is great, but what we found earlier this summer was some folks on the import side of the ledger were ordering just in case, not just in time. In fact, back in October, we levied a plan of penalty against long aging containers on our docks. At that time, more than 40% of all imports had not moved in 9 days or more.
Since the threat of the penalty fee was announced, the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach saw a combined decline of 62% in aging cargo on the docks. The slowdown saw retailers take action of their own too. In an effort to avoid bottlenecks, Home Depot, Walmart, Amazon, and others began chartering their own ships. Stretching from Honolulu to New York, there are more than 24 U.S. ports that are equipped to handle containerized cargo. In 2019, 59% of all cargo transported between the US and Asia came via ship. That same year, 42% of goods transported between the US and Europe went by boat. But while shipping is a key component of US trade, America has some of the least efficient ports in the world, according to a recent World Bank and IHS Markit study. In a review of 351 global container ports, the Southern California ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which handle 40% of US container imports, didn't break into the top 300. The Port of Los Angeles ranked 328th behind Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The Port of Long Beach came in 333rd behind Nimrut Bay, Turkey. Ports in Asia and the Middle East were ranked on top. Asian ports, for example, are considered up to 50% more productive than their US counterparts, due in part to Asian factories and terminals working 24 hours a day, versus US dock workers who generally don't operate on the weekends. Moving goods in off-peak hours has other benefits too, like reducing congestion along highways, railroads, and in warehouses.
We work traditionally about 19 hours a day here at the port, and with the surge, we've been flexing, opening a little early, crossing over lunch times, as well as for the transition to the evening gates beginning at 6 o'clock. We've also said that we would be open 24 hours a day, but we've had very few takers. The warehouses traditionally work during the days, and for truckers, we've seen that 30% of our appointments to pick up cargo continue to go unused every day.
Another problem, according to analysts, is the lack of automation. A study by management consulting firm McKinsey found that a successfully automated port could see productivity rise by up to 35% and operating expenses fall by over 50%.
Compared to comparable ports in Europe, the US ports are, generally speaking, much less efficient. And there's several explanations to it. Number one is lack of automation.
The unions on both coasts have been quite vocal in opposing automation in their contracts and using their really extreme leverage to ensure that their future contracts don't have what they call job-killing provisions allowing for additional automation.
In 2021, the International Longshoremen's Association, a labor union representing dock workers on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, warned shipping lines and developers of automated vessels that members would not work ships without crew aboard. It also negotiated an agreement to prevent automation at ILA ports.
Around the world, only about 5% of ports are automated today. Here in Southern California, there are 2 marine terminals on the Los Angeles side and 1 on the Long Beach side that have some semblance of automation. There's work together to be done between the Employers Association and the ILWU to make sure that if this technology continues to progress, the worker is not left behind. We have to make sure we can upskill, reskill, and make great middle-class jobs here on the waterfront, even in the advent of technological advancement.
But much of the congestion we're seeing originates far from the docks, according to the Pacific Maritime Association, a nonprofit group that secures labor for West Coast terminal operators. The group said West Coast port congestion is largely driven by the cumulative collapse of the entire logistics supply chain, including a critical shortage of industrial warehouse space in Los Angeles, as well as a dearth of shipping containers, rail cars, trucks, and chassis. A lack of truck drivers is another problem. The industry is short by more than 80,000 drivers nationwide, and the shortage could surpass 160,000 by 2030. Warehouse workers are also in short supply.
On the warehouse landscape, we're short 400,000 warehouse workers nationwide and about 8 to 10,000 here in Southern California.
The challenge is we're talking about maybe 20 years of a lack of proper investment is now hitting us. And it's hard to see how that can be reversed in a very short span of time.
And yet another issue hampering ports, according to one analyst, is the 100-year-old Jones Act, which requires goods transported on water between U.S. ports to be shipped aboard vessels that are U.S. built and owned and crewed by U.S. citizens. That, in effect, makes it cheaper to ship goods via highways or rail than on water.
So a lot of countries have a system where you have a massive container ship goes into a massive port that's of course fully automated and open 24/7, and then these little feeder ships take the cargo and then go to the smaller ports all around the country. Well, we don't have that. Instead, we have these massive ships that show up at one port, and to avoid the Jones Act, they port hop down to the rest of the ports with less and less cargo, because you can't pick up new cargo when you're there, all the way down. It's a crazy system, but that's the system we have.
For years, California's portside communities has suffered disproportionately from high rates of air pollution and pollution-related illnesses. And while levels of outdoor air pollutants have fallen in the state over the last 3 decades, Los Angeles County remains one of the most polluted parts of the country. Port slowdowns have only exacerbated the situation. Chris Chavez works at the nonprofit Coalition for Clean Air and lives near the Port of Long Beach.
We have seen, particularly when we were having the congestion at the ports, the number of ships waiting outside, where you had at some points over 100 ships waiting to enter the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, huge increases in both smog forming and cancer causing pollution.
Container vessels make up about half of port-related air emissions. With a logjam of ships idling near the San Pedro ports in October 2021, pollution increased to roughly the equivalent of the emissions from 5.8 million passenger cars. Trucks, train, and terminal equipment are another source of pollution.
Ships are a very significant factor when it comes to air pollution here. Another big factor, again, is the trucks. Trucks are, just by their sheer amount of trucks in this region, older trucks have less strict emission controls on them.
Freight transportation is linked to higher rates of asthma, cancer, and other illnesses, and is the largest contributor to diesel particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions in California. Global shipping in general is responsible for about 30% of worldwide NOx emissions and has been linked to thousands of premature deaths in coastal areas around the world.
But what we need to realize is that when we do order, that can have an effect on another community. If you're buying a TV, if you're buying a good from the Midwest, there's a very good chance that it's going to go past my neighborhood. A very good chance it's going to go down the freeway, that many other trucks are carrying goods either to warehouses, for national distribution, or beyond.
In an effort to reduce emissions, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in 2006 created a Clean Air Action Plan to reduce the health risks posed by air pollution. The port says air pollution is down drastically since 2005. The port has also provided financial incentives for ships with newer engines and for ships that reduce speeds to 12 knots when entering the San Pedro Bay harbor. When ships slow down, they burn less fuel, resulting in fewer emissions. And with the goal of eliminating emissions from all trucks calling at the port by 2035, last summer the port debuted 5 hydrogen-powered fuel cell electric vehicles, along with 2 hydrogen fueling stations. Currently, the port is testing 107 zero-emission units in the areas of cargo handling and harbor crafts. And financial investments could help ports too. The Biden administration's infrastructure package sets aside $17 billion to fix the nation's ports. And California Governor Gavin Newsom's 2022-2023 state budget proposal allocates $2.3 billion for its ports. But despite those measures, analysts say we are unlikely to see relief in our supply chain anytime soon.
There's nothing that indicating that this is going the right way. It hasn't gotten much worse in the last couple of months, but it is still horrendously poor. At the moment, less than 10% of all vessels that arrive in the North American West Coast ports are on time. More than 90% of vessels are more than 1 day late. And that's compared to normally would see 70 to 80% being on time.
Shipping delays have crippled the economy since the pandemic started. They came to a head when a ship ran aground in the Suez Canal.
And it is blocking ships both ways in one of the world's busiest waterways.
This sparked a conversation. Was there another way we could ship supplies around the world? Maybe over the top?
Arctic sea routes are potentially much more useful for avoiding the kind of bottlenecks that one would see in either the Panama or Suez Canal or the Malacca Straits.
Melting sea ice in the Arctic has opened the region up to more human activity than ever.
Companies are trying out the route between Asia and Europe.
Shipping in particular has increased 25% between 2013 and 2019.
It can be extremely brutally cold in the Arctic, and then you can have a beautiful sunny day.
By perhaps as early as 2035, it'll be possible to actually send a ship right over the North Pole in the summer months.
That the region can be traveled across in a smooth and relatively safe fashion because there's no ice is very scary.
We don't think that that is an environmentally responsible thing to do, and we frankly want no part of it.
Others argue it could help emit less carbon by making travel times shorter. China claims using the Northern Sea Route would save almost 20 days off the shipping time now spent traveling through the Suez Canal.
It's really a question of saving shipping costs, saving time versus that lack of predictability.
So, should the Arctic be open for shipping?
To try to exactly figure out where the Arctic begins and ends is very much open to interpretation. Every country has their own definition of it.
The traditional understanding is anything above the 60-degree mark. The U.S. is one of 8 Arctic states, 5 of which are coastal. To travel through the Arctic, sailors need a specialized ship called an icebreaker. This summer, the U.S. Coast Guard's largest icebreaker, the U.S. Healy, traveled through the Arctic via the Northwest Passage. At the helm was Captain Kenneth Boda.
This is, I think, my 7th year on icebreakers. So it's kind of what I do. Icebreaking is amazing. It's one of the neatest jobs I think there is to do. I think this is only the 3rd time that Healy has done a Northwest Passage, and we haven't done it in over 15 years. So the Northwest Passage is basically the passage between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, north of North America.
The Northwest Passage is situated in relatively friendly geopolitical waters, but very unfriendly topography.
Really, the Northwest Passage consists of a number of different passages through here. It's not just one lane. There's, I think, 10 different passages that you can work in. It's only been done by about 300 ships throughout history. The timing is very difficult. So you only have a narrow window where there's not a lot of ice to get through, but you're going to encounter some ice. And when you encounter that ice, you don't know how long it's going to take you to get through. We saw some really amazing things in the Northwest Passage. We saw a mama and baby polar bear on the ice, which was awesome. We saw the Northern Lights. We operated in some areas you can only call iceberg alleys, where there's icebergs all around us. It's very nerve-wracking to do it when you're driving it. It's very nerve-wracking to try and sleep when you know that we're driving through an iceberg area like that.
For a very long time, you had to have a very specialized vessel in order to get through there. But year by year, it is becoming much easier to send ships through.
Canada has always claimed that the Northwest Passage lies within Canadian waters, territorial waters. The U.S. does not accept that, but we're not going to get into an argument about it.
There are 2 other potential ways to cross the Arctic. The Northern Sea Route is the least treacherous physically, but you should have good relations with Russia.
The Northern Sea Route is, of course, the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific over the Eurasian continent. You can get a little bit of the way through the Northern Sea Route into the Barents Sea and open water, and then the rest of the way is going to be, really ice-clogged waters.
Now, the 3rd route, and the one which doesn't exist yet, but might exist very soon, is the Central Arctic route. That's the one that will actually take ships right north of the North Pole.
The route that goes directly through the central Arctic Sea is really not under question right now because the ice is just candidly not going to be thin enough for ships to allow to go through.
My name is Daly Sambodero, and I am the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council that represents the Inuit, or the real people in English. We occupy, in terms of our traditional homelands, approximately 50% of the Arctic.
Sambodero's organization is recognized as a permanent participant at the Arctic Council, which is the leading intergovernmental forum in the region.
Over the past year, we've seen the Biden government pledge to work more closely with the other Arctic Council members. Now, this is very interesting because Russia is currently holding the chair of the Arctic Council. So this has placed the United States in an interesting position. So it is a potential problem, but also a potential opportunity.
I don't think that there is an easy answer in terms of whether increased shipping would be good or bad. I think that the necessary regime for controlling that activity needs to be put in place, and it needs to be recognized.
China is also very interested in developing the Arctic region for shipping, calling itself a near-Arctic state. It has signaled to Russia a commitment to building infrastructure on the Northern Sea Route, pledging to build a, quote, Polar Silk Road over a 5-year plan from 2021 to 2025. It also announced plans to launch a satellite to track shipping routes and monitor changes in the Arctic sea ice.
I would predict that probably by 2035, we might be seeing sea-free ice summers throughout the Northern Sea Route. Again, probably not in the Northwest Passage. And that comes down to just the differences in topographies.
Overall, Arctic sea ice has diminished over 750,000 square miles from 1999 to 2019.
It's highly likely that as sea ice continues to diminish, that we can see more projects in Russia as well as in the circumpolar Arctic.
Russia and China are the major shippers on the route. They've collaborated to bring liquefied natural gas from Siberia and Russia to a newly built pipeline to China.
The Northern Sea Route's already being used to transport around 34 million tons of cargo a year.
Private shipping companies like Maersk traversed the Northern Sea Route in 2018, exploring the possibility of expanding to the region. However, they decided it wasn't worth it. MSC decided the same thing.
No matter what the economic costs may be day to day, that environmental cost potentially just outweighs the rewards of taking a shorter trade route.
The Arctic also has little infrastructure to assist ships in case of emergency, say if a sailor gets sick or any other unforeseen circumstance. Navigation is also extremely difficult, although a project is underway with the help of the U.S. Coast Guard to map the Arctic seabed by 2030.
We don't think the Northern Sea Routes are appropriate for transit of our ships and commerce in general.
You know, you get commercial traffic up there and they get stuck in the ice and they get crushed. You know, if that oil gets into the Arctic, cleaning it up is going to be a huge challenge. Trying to separate the oil from the ice is probably near impossible without really, hands-on approach. Techniques that you can use in open water, like skimming the oil off the surface, aren't going to work that well in the Arctic with ice chunks floating and things like that. The native communities in the Arctic, the Alaskan natives and the Canadian First Peoples, they use the resources. Obviously they fish and hunt in the water in the Arctic Ocean.
The idea that by 2035 that the region can be traveled across in a smooth and relatively safe fashion because there's no ice is very scary. Sea ice is crucial. It's integral to our way of life. And that's why we can characterize climate change as such a crisis, that it is front and center, a force that has had a devastating effect on our communities already, and we haven't seen the end of it.
When you say Arctic shipping, you're not only focusing on sort of transits between Asia and Europe or something like that. There are so many different types of shipping and so many reasons that ships are actually navigating in the Arctic that you have to differentiate between them. And in the Arctic, destinational transport is the most common one. And that, of course, coincides with diminishing sea ice.
Destinational transport means to and from the Arctic, not across it. This increase has been seen for a couple of main reasons: harvesting natural resources and supporting the people in the Arctic.
Shipping from the Arctic has the implication that we're doing oil, gas, critical mineral mining.
Ore and iron are the two main minerals that can be harvested in the Arctic.
So in the EU's 2021 Arctic policy, they recently stated they're going to seek a moratorium on coal, oil, and gas extraction in the Arctic, but importantly, not on critical minerals.
Another main resource in the Arctic? Fish.
In 2019, for example, over 40% of ships are fishing vessels.
This is essential to maintaining our traditional economic activity, which is hunting, fishing, and gathering.
Shipping to the Arctic also has interesting implications because in many cases that can be food for some of these remote communities that are no longer able to access their traditional food sources.
Our coastal communities across Inuit and Nunaat rely upon the barges that provide goods and services to our communities. Climate change and increased vessel traffic, they're linked, but they're compounded by all kinds of other changes. You have climate change, you have increased vessel traffic, the potential for pollution, the industrial fishing. It's just like bam, bam, bam. And our people are bearing the brunt of it.
Shipping could provide an opportunity for economic growth to help protect the Arctic way of life.
One opportunity certainly is construct deep water ports, not only for the receipt of goods and services, but also the possible economic benefit of being the managers and owners of such ports so that you can ensure that your services for vessels are used and that the community benefits.
We try and work with them to make sure they understand what we're doing, has a positive impact in the environment as we leave. So.
Certainly one way of helping those communities is to have a private sector company come in and say, we would like to use this area of your land, and in exchange, we'll help you build up infrastructure, we'll help you move away from these really dangerous areas. And while that's certainly a step up from not doing anything, it does present, I think, interesting questions for the communities.
In the meantime, Russia and China continue to build up infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route, including a fleet of icebreakers. The U.S. only has one other icebreaker to the Healy, the very old Polar Star, which is currently in Antarctica. This could mean Russia may be better prepared to lead the Arctic in economic growth.
Will the people who actually live in the Arctic benefit from not only container trade, but also tourism, fishing? Will the profits and will the benefits simply go southward, or will they actually be shared with the region? The other problem that is really starting to appear, especially over the past year or so, many countries, including the United States and Russia, are starting to look at the Arctic from a more kind of strategic lens. Countries have said, for example, I could point to Russia, which has started to greatly build up its military presence along the coast of Siberia and in its part of the Arctic. And this will lead to greater security problems between Russia and NATO. And again, we're talking about Arctic populations that are being caught in the middle of this, that have very little say in what could be the militarization of the Arctic as it becomes more well known as an economic zone.